Welcome to our co-hosted WorkBuzz and Gallagher webinar on driving culture and engagement through internal communications. During this webinar, what we want to do is really bring to life why we're working together. So myself at WorkBuzz and our wonderful partners at Gallagher that we'll introduce you to shortly, Sian and Drew. And what we want to do is bring a bit of life to why we've formed this partnership. But for us, it's really about embedding employee listening into your organisational culture so that it doesn't come across as something that's completely separate to how we listen within a culture and how we build that culture and strategy for our people. We want to bring to life how we use data to turn insights into actionable employee engagement strategies. It's one thing listening, but it's a completely different thing, as you'll all understand, especially internal communicators, acting and creating behaviours off the back of engagement surveys and feedback. And the final point that we're wanting to bring to life about our partnership is we're hoping to build some genuine engagement and a sense of belonging that drive business results. So that million-dollar question everybody in internal comms gets asked about, what's the return on investment? Well, we're hoping to give you more data and more examples about how we can bring that to life a bit better during this webinar. In terms of today's panel and those speaking, so you've got myself, my name's Melisande Foster, or Mel for short, and I'm Customer Experience Officer here at WorkBuzz, where I'm responsible for all our customer experience and making sure that they have a wonderful time as they partner with us. And I'm joined by the wonderful team at Gallagher. Sian, do you want to kick off introductions?
Thanks, Mel. I am Sian Cleese. I am a strategy partner at the Gallagher Communications practice. So the things that I look at in my day-to-day, I look at how internal communications can help influence the employee experience and engagement, and also how do we look at the data and the insights and all of the stuff that's out in the kind of zeitgeist of the world of work, and how do we bring them to our clients and make sure that they're giving their employees the best experience. Drew?
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Drew Munn. I'm also a strategy partner at Gallagher. So my role predominantly is to look at how we're shifting the needle in terms of from a digital perspective, from a data perspective, and from the way that we work with our employees' perspective into what we're trying to develop for 5, 10, 20 years down the line. So looking at what we've got in place today, what cool new solutions are becoming available, and how we can apply that innovation to being better employers.
Thank you, Drew and Sian. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing and I will let Drew take over sharing screen. This is a very technical, fun part of the webinar, everybody. I'm sure you've all been in this seat before, but I'm really excited to be here with Gallagher. I've come from a background of internal comms where Gallagher was the name where I looked to for best practice, and being able to work with Sian and Drew, I've really seen them bring some of this to life. So do you want to give a bit more of an intro into the organisation with that at that point?
Yeah, so Gallagher, we've been around within the employee experience space for about 10 years. We cover literally the entire employee life cycle, we like to say, from pre-joining through to leaving, and then in some cases on through the rest of your employee's life cycle as well. And pretty much the entire remit. So what we're trying to do is change the way people feel about work, and that's every single touch point. So how you talk to your employees, how you engage with the business that you actually do day to day, how you make sure that you're hiring the right people, how you're engaging them throughout their lives, how you're incentivizing them, how you're getting the most out of them, and then how you're ensuring that they feel connected to your vision from that day one through them leaving. So we cover as much as we possibly can that entire remit, and the way that we do it is to effectively try and make people feel part of your organization. So we're there to help engage your employees, to help translate your business strategies into communication, and in as much as we possibly can, help your employees feed back into that process as well. So that's where the natural work comes in terms of synergies with WorkBuzz. It's great to be able to produce an awesome culture and an awesome tone of voice and an awesome set of communications, but if you're not talking to your employees, if you're not seeing how it's landing and how it's working, then it's pretty useless. Obviously, to back us all up in all of that work, we run State of the Sector, which is one of the largest internal comm surveys that's run. We run it annually. You can download a copy of this year's report now, a shameless plug from our side. It's super valuable, and it's kind of what we use to set the benchmark for every single year as we go through to see what the industry is doing, how it's doing it, what's changed in the last few years, and how we can make sure that we're reacting to that to be as useful as we possibly can. In this latest report, we've got over 2,000 respondents. Now, that's quite a good mix, and it brings us quite nicely into one of the points from today's work, which is it's not just IC professionals anymore answering this. We have a huge number of HR professionals or people who report into HR lines. So we've seen communication really shift from this subset of marketing into this subset of people. And that's been hugely valuable for us to see how that shift has happened. And hopefully it means that the results within the survey are also feeding back into your goals a bit more valuably too. So you can see we've got a good mix across the board, different sectors, different niches, different sizes, and from different places around the globe, and that gives us a really good overview of actually how the organizations that we work with are changing and how the market's changing around them as well. Each year we kind of try and break down what's happening in our reports to really focus on specific key topics, and this is a highlight of some of those big areas that we've seen. And you'll see as we look back, quite often those reports are focused on very specific events. So Office 365 is a great example where one specific change by Microsoft really altered the entire way communication happens across the board, for better or for worse. That's an argument for another time. And even as recently as 2021, where we had COVID as the huge impactor that was changing the way that things happened. This year, we started to see that almost balance back out to be more of a holistic view to comms. We've gone through a process where we're suddenly in front of the C-suite. We're all super important people as communicators because we had to be throughout COVID. And we've been thrown all these new channels to work with, all this new funding, all this new tech, and ultimately all of these new responsibilities. And now 2023 is an opportunity for us to sit down and go, great, what is it that we actually do? And how do we fit into this business structure? Because it's more than just talking to our people. We need to have the full framework in place. So it's been a really interesting year from that perspective. And as we tried to break it down and look at actually what that means from a results perspective, one of the key areas that we like to pull out is purpose. And the value for us as communicators is being able to meet whatever our company is defined as our purpose. And as you can see, culture and belonging is right up there. Our purpose isn't anymore just to make sure people know when an office is closed. It is really to make sure that people know why the business is there, know what they should be doing, feel like they're part of it. It used to be that culture was the office space, culture was talking to colleagues, and it was all this natural interaction. And now so much of that's been stripped away for so many employees. It's the job of internal comms, the only people who talk to each other, to make sure that we bring that back to the forefront. And it's really interesting how that one's shot up the ranks. And alongside that, we've still got the things that we'd usually expect to see. And agility and alignment with the strategy is obviously a big part of that, to make sure that what we're delivering aligns with what the business is doing. But we've shown our value in helping transform businesses through COVID. We need to keep that agility around in the business. So as everything else settles back down, comms is seen as that key indicator to keep things moving. If we break down the priorities that our individual respondents had, they fit quite nicely into a series of groups. So again, you'll see these top 3 priorities, which shouldn't come as much a surprise to anyone. They are the burning questions that we get all of the time. But what I think really fits into there is some of those smaller ones that are still priorities, but fall into that slightly less important category. And you can map quite nicely all of those into actually feeding into that bigger vision. So every single element of those priorities feed up into those top 3, and they're all very much aligned with those purpose-driven goals that we're now working towards. If we look at the challenges, that opposite side, again, something really interesting is happening. We went through probably the busiest period for communicators over the last few years. And now we're coming out of it and things should be settling down. People are getting back to some form of normal. a lack of time, a lack of capacity, a lack of budget is all still super important and causing us massive issues. So what we try and do there is look at why that's the case. And obviously we've taken on so many new jobs through COVID. We've gone from being the people who send 1 email a month to the people who send 3 emails a day. And it's up to us to make sure that people are joining their teams webinars. It's up to us to make sure people are doing their L&D. It's up to us to make sure the whole culture of the organization doesn't fall over. And realistically, the function hasn't grown massively in that time. And obviously there's the whole world of AI and what's that going to do to reduce our workloads. But in reality, that's not usably here right now for the majority of us. We're still having to work with what we've got and do all of these extra tasks. If we look across on the slightly lower challenges, again, you've got some interesting things coming up. One of them that's got a 6% answer is too many internal communications channels. We hear this a lot, especially, again, post-COVID, the number of channels that were thrown out there, and now it's up to us to manage them. Yet we don't have time to do our normal jobs. We don't have the budget to do our normal jobs, yet we have 10, 20 extra channels to deal with. All of those things are potentially problems with one solution rather than multiple problems, each with their own solution. So working through what that means and how we can kind of tick those off the list whilst also meeting our priorities are super important. One of the things that continues to be problematic, I think we'll all agree, within the organizations that we work with, is measurement. And measurement is super important. It's something that, well, I come from a data background, so I love measurement because it gets me more data. But from the world of comms and the world of delivering what we're trying to do, it's worthless if we don't know how it's landing. And if we're putting all of our time and effort into pushing comms out, we're not doing that extra step of listening in. And Sean will touch on that in a lot more detail a bit later. But what I wanted to highlight was some of the reasons that we saw as to why we're seeing that lack of measurement. And again, it's down to lack of time, lack of resource, lack of data potentially being available either internally or external benchmarking data. And all of these things are just stopping us doing that part of our role, I'd argue, a very valuable part of our role. And we have to try and find new ways to overcome these to make sure that actually we're delivering value in comms. And as we've got that seat at the table with more of those C-suite ears listening in on us, what we're hearing is more people need more of this data. We're being asked to prove ROI. We're being asked to prove the value of what we're doing, but we're just not putting those measurements in place effectively or as quickly as we should because we have all these barriers in the way. If we actually break down quickly what measurement means, we can see that the traditional stuff like reach always been valuable, always been important, and just simple things like who's reading the emails that we're sending out. A decently high portion of people, still slightly disappointingly low, but enough people are recording that kind of thing. But as soon as you start to break down into the what are they doing off the back of reading those emails, then we get this huge drop off. So we're not going out on a regular basis to understand, do people read our emails and act on them? Are we changing the way people do things? Are we actually affecting that purpose? Our goal is to align everybody to a purpose and a vision, but if we're not measuring whether or not that's happening, all we're doing is measuring how many emails we've sent, it's almost by the by and pretty useless in terms of actual data back up to the C-suite. So what we really need to do and what's more valuable across the board is trying to shift some of that across to that other side. So out of just reach statistics, work out how we can be pulling in data that helps us measure understanding, measure business change and outcomes, measure satisfaction, and push all of that back up. So that's the statistic that we're reporting back rather than just how many emails we've sent out. I know Sean's going to touch on a lot more of this as we move into employee listening. So I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Drew. So we've talked a little bit about the barriers to measurement, so the quantitative side and gathering that data, but I also wanted to look at more qualitative side, so employee listening. And that's why we're really excited to be working with WorkBuzz on this, because, you know, that's how you listen through surveys and all of that jazz. But for us as an agency over the last sort of 10 years, we've seen this shift, as you saw through that kind of timeline, the state of the sector. We've gone from internal communications through to now kind of employee experience, and the role that communications is playing is different. So as Drew said, we've gone from people who might be kind of passing messages through the organization to comms being everywhere, all the time, every channel always on. So, through that, it's really easy to lose sight of the fact that, communications isn't just top down, but it also should be bottom up. So, this peer-to-peer talking, the employee to leadership talking, where does all this information go and how are we capturing it? So in terms of employee feedback on the next slide, some of our findings from State of the Sector this year, we found that like most organizations, they do value employee feedback. We've got 84% that agree that, employee feedback is important, but that drops when we look at who in their organization is actually learning and acting based off of that feedback. So as Drew said, we need to know how things are landing, but are we pivoting? Are we evolving our comm strategy accordingly? Maybe not, it's dropping, and even lower still, and perhaps worrying is that 47% of organizations think that they have a robust process for capturing all of this listening, all of this data, all of this feedback. So less than half, which is slightly concerning. But if we have a look at the next slide and we look at actually how are we listening from an organizational point of view, it's kind of a lot of ad hoc kind of qualitative data points that we're collecting. So number one, maybe not so surprising, the engagement survey at 69%. So 69% of our respondents say that is sort of the way that they've captured feedback in the last 12 months. But interestingly, across the channel spread, only 55% of respondents said that their channels gave them opportunity to gather feedback. So if we look down the list after that survey, we've got email, feedback from people managers, and one-to-one interviews as number 2, 3, and 4. So, if you look at the spread of listening channels, really very ad hoc, very hard to kind of corral all of that feedback into something useful for the organization to act upon. So obviously we know what gets measured gets done. So if we're not measuring these things, how can we be improving the employee experience through communications? Quite tricky. And so just picking up on one point on the next slide, feedback from people managers being the number 3 listening channel, chosen by, I think was it 51% of respondents. So the key critical role that managers play, are there tools for them? Are they able to see, the quantitative data? Are they able to act upon data from those surveys? Are we giving managers a way for themselves to be feeding back to the organization? Are we listening to the listeners? So a bit of people managers is always that sort of age-old thing. They are so key critical to the employee experience, and even more so increasingly for communication. So are we making sure that we're covering their needs as part of our listening strategy? And if we have a look at what we're actually using, all of this quantitative and this qualitative data and all this feedback, what are we using it for? Well, most people are using that data to provide value or show return on investment to the leader. So obviously we know we need to sort of prove our worth. And it's great to see that we're able to do that if we've got great data. But what sort of starts to be a little bit worrying is that kind of, we look at number 2, refining our channel framework based on high and low performing channels. We're looking at how channels are performing. Number 3, adjusting our messaging as part of a campaign. Employee needs are quite far down that list. So we're kind of caring about leadership first, and then we're kind of worrying about how our channels are doing, all the way down to tailoring types of content and that kind of thing. So there was a survey done recently that I found 60% of respondents will prioritize senior leader buy-in over employee preferences. So we're listening to employees, but are we acting on what they're saying? Perhaps not. We are maybe always being accountable to leadership rather than to our audiences. So how can we make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs and hitting that kind of ROI with our data and our insights? The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is the difference between sort of listening and being heard. So we've got lots of listening channels. We know number 1 is the engagement survey. Below that, there's a few ad hoc kind of, emails, leadership kind of ad hoc channels. We're admitting that they're not robust. So less than half of people say that they think it's a robust process. And we're measuring, but we're measuring for leadership rather than for employees. So, all of that said, how are we overcoming that number 2 barrier around disengaged employees? Well, perhaps they're disengaged because they're not feeling heard. And I think this is where communications and HR really come into play, because these, I mean, from my personal opinion, everything is communication. Something you see, something you hear, something you kind of body language, everything is comms. Are people feeling heard throughout that? And you know what's really interesting on the next slide is that employees in the UK with a very high sense of belonging are more likely to feel heard than those with a low sense of belonging. So there's this kind of clear relationship between belonging and feeling heard. And, you know, if we think about back to that kind of first slide there, we asked this year, what do you believe is the purpose of internal communications? If that number one, at 74%, the number one purpose of comms is to create an inclusive culture and sort of support culture and belonging, then if you're not properly listening, you're kind of breaking the whole thing. You're not delivering on your purpose. And, you know, one of the top reasons for employee turnover, and this is from Forbes, is that employees are just really tired of being overlooked. So simple but not easy. Can we be listening to our employees? And actually, if you do listen to employees, what are the benefits? So on the next slide, we've got 74% of employees are more effective at their job when they feel heard. So we can sort of draw this big ring around it. So if we're listening, are we acting? If we're acting, you know, do people know that we're acting? Are we feeding that loop back? And actually, if people feel that they're listened to, they belong, and if they're belonging and heard, then they'll be more productive. And you know what? There's been a study done about how employees actually feel heard. So beyond being listened to, how do they feel heard? The answer to that, people feel heard when action is taken. So we can gather all the data we like, qualitative, quantitative, but it's knowing what to action, what to prioritize, and communicating that change back that is actually going to result in people feeling heard. And moreover, companies that perform well financially have more employees who feel heard compared to employees who do not feel heard. So it's a bit long-winded way of saying, bottom line for the business, it's better that people feel heard. Probably not surprising, you know, follows logically. So kind of rounding back and handing back over to Drew, looking at listening now and measuring and the relationship between them.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think, Sean, you and me were having a conversation about a client a couple of days ago, and one of the things that you said was never ask questions that you're not ready to act on. And that goes right back into that point, doesn't it? If what you're doing, especially when 90% of your workforce are remote, if all you're doing is pushing out loads of surveys or asking your managers to gather loads of feedback on specific things, and that just appears to go into a big black hole, then what's the point of asking the question in the first place? You're actively inviting disengagement. You're telling those people you're sat at home, occasionally we'll ask you questions and nothing will happen. That's how you create a bad feeling about the work that you're doing. And so closing that loop, creating that measurement circle is super valuable, because what it allows you to do is say, I know why I'm asking what I'm asking, so I know what I should be listening for, and then I know to make sure that actually that there's been an outcome that I can feed back and say, hey, look, guys, we listened, this is what we did. And obviously there's a huge argument to be had for you can't do everything to please all of your employees. You're always going to have people answering surveys in negative ways. You're always going to have those few disengaged people. And actually the way that listening and through measurement works is that's fine. Like we know there's going to be disengaged people, but if you have the right listening structures in place and you can measure the results of that listening, then you'll see they're in the minority. The problem is most people don't. And so most people listen to the loudest voice, and the limit of their measurement is one person told me this doesn't work, and so it doesn't work. Not one person said it doesn't work, but 100 other people said it was the best thing they've ever seen. And that's where that measurement comes in, because you can start to contextualize it, not just within an individual question, but within actually what you're meant to be doing. So if we go all the way back up to the top, when we were talking about the fact that our goal as a communication function more than ever is to drive purpose, to drive engagement, to drive belonging within a company, what you should be measuring is how well you're doing that job. And it's super difficult. We came up with a framework of what we call 9 hallmarks that help us find little cheats and tricks and ways to either do it or prove that we're doing it. because it's almost impossible to eat that entire elephant at once. You have to sit down and start working through each of those different areas piece by piece. And all of these are about connecting your comms function into your people function, into your employees, into your measurement, into your IT, so you can get the data back that you want, into your HR platform, so you understand what's happening, and to close that entire loop. And really working through each of these in order, you can see how they fall back onto the basic level. So if we're saying you want to be connected to the strategy of your business, do you actually have a defined strategy? If an employee comes to you and says, what's our strategy? What's your answer? As a comms function, you should be able to communicate that. And you should have a clear narrative that runs around it. And you should know what channels you're using to do your job, and you can manage them effectively. And then we look through all of the rest of them. And really key is the second one on, not the first one on that second line, that focus on insight, measurement, and evaluation. Because one of the things that you'll have heard as a communicator so many times is, oh, I want world-class comms. I want the kind of comms that you get from a business that you interact with as a customer. That's what our employees want, consumer-centric comms. Here's something for you. Almost any good consumer company is a data company. They are a company who listens intently to everything their buyers say, acts exactly as their buyers are likely to want them to, and continues to develop their services based on that. They aren't a company who sits in a high tower and says, no, you do things our way or you're not doing it. And it's like the key thing that makes those companies great. And as communicators, we're constantly striving for those goals, but we kind of don't implement any of it. We kind of go, oh, measurement's too difficult. Let's steer clear of it. So to be able to measure, we need to know what we're measuring, why we're measuring it, actually what those real outcomes are, because they're not opens of emails. They are real action taken off the back of them, and seeing how that works. And all of that kind of boils down into the key point, which is you need to benchmark yourself. This is an internal thing, an external thing, however you look at it, however you do it. How are you proving that your comms function has gone from state 1 today to state 2 tomorrow, and helped meet all of those goals that the business has set for you? Because unless you know how you're doing, you're not ever going to be able to report back on progress. It's really laughable as a function, people in general, and the way that we benchmark ourselves is still so archaic, especially given the kind of roles that we have to do now are so advanced compared to a lot of the business that we operate in. We are the first people to be talking about embracing AI. We are the first people to be talking about making sure that we're attracting Gen Z and beyond as workforce. We're the first people talking about how remote working is changing the culture of our environments. Yet we're still not actually looking back and going, hey, 3 years ago, we never did any of this. 3 years ago, we were rubbish. And this is actually how we've changed. So unless you sit back and unless you benchmark yourself, you're never really going to be able to align with that. Part of that's introspection, and part of that is talking to your employees, talking to your actual audience, seeing how their views have changed over the last few years. And to help with that, we built the tool. So this is a super quick thing that feel free to go away with and play. It benchmarks you against those 9 hallmarks that we presented and gives you some super quick actionable insights. So helping get you up and running with actually putting in some of those different items and making them part of your strategy, and really, really basic things that you'll sit there and go, hey, I've known about this for years, but actually this is how I could implement it. This is the first step on that journey. And a lot of it's just about listening and making sure you have those structures in place to do that listening. Once you get into there, and obviously you can play around and see how you compare to some of the people that we've spoken to in other areas. So you can see people in your sector, how you compare against them, people in similar size companies to you, and that kind of thing. Is super interesting, but what that sets up is a bit of a plan for you to think about how you can develop going forward. And a really big part of that is making sure that any changes you make, you're constantly going back to asking your audience, your employees, has this made a difference? Has everything that we've just done, all of that effort that we just put in, changed the way you see this company? Because that is our goal. And if we're not tying everything back to that, then there's no point investing all this time, effort, change in doing it. It should be all about improving that employee experience. So you can go away, play with this tool, come up with all of the actions that it recommends, put them all in place. But unless you're constantly going back and saying, hey, how's this for you on the shop floor? How's this for you at your desk? Then it's partially worthless. So that's why, as we said at the top, being able to work with people like WorkBuzz is super interesting, because it lets us talk and it lets us close that loop. And a big part of it from our perspective is creating that holistic experience. We want employees to feel like they're the reason we exist. And right now, as Sian said, the majority of the time, we exist because a stakeholder wants us to exist. And let's shift that balance. Let's shift the way that we're working and the kind of things that we're doing.
Insightful, and I think there's been many asks for your slides already. So yes, we will be sharing those after the webinar, as well as a recording for everybody to share elsewhere should you wish. But some really insightful things that were said there then, and I've got some questions of my own, but audience, please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you do have. What I'll do is I'll start by kicking off with a question to Sian and Drew, if that's okay, and then we'll see what can come from there. And I think what I love is that you're speaking about benchmarking and that need to always benchmark yourself. That continuous improvement is really critical. But something that's always been a challenge has been the difference of opinions, let's say, between leadership and the employee base. And that ability to push back as an internal communications function. How do you see that working in practice? What tools would you recommend that our IC practitioners equip themselves with to better push back on senior leaders that, look, this is what the employees have said, I know that you want it, how do they help them change their minds?
I think that from my perspective, all of that comes back to data, and the difficulty with opinion is data is so difficult. You can't say, hey, the employees are asking this because it's actually going to be valuable. And that's kind of the burden of proof that you end up with, especially a senior stakeholder will go in automatically assuming their opinion is the right one, and automatically assuming that you're the one that's going to have to prove them wrong before you can change that. And a lot of that is about level setting, how you interact at that C-suite level, and just across the board. Going into a conversation like that, saying our employees are asking for this, and being able to immediately tie that back to your business vision. So it's not just saying our employees want to change the way we do things. It's going and saying our employees have actively asked us to do this, which we feel aligns with 1, 7, and 5 of our business goals. That actually ties into the way that we're doing things. And it's not necessarily going to be perfect, obviously, and it's not necessarily going to be the case of saying, hey, this will save you X thousand, it's going to stop attrition, it's going to do X, Y, Z. But what it is about is saying everything that we're doing is tied back to that one root cause. You around this table are asking for something different. Can you prove that what you're asking for ties in the same way? And you'll find that you are much better at legitimately explaining your reasoning, because employees are employees of a business mostly because they want to be there, and they want to be there because they buy into the business and the purpose of the business. And when you start surveying and collect that data en masse, the asks that come out of that will usually be aligned with the business. You're very unlikely to get a large number of employees asking for something that's very unaligned with the business, whereas one person at a C-suite table who just happens to have a mate who showed them something at the pub last night, their ask is going to be related to what they think is cool, not necessarily what the business should be doing.
Yeah, I love that. Almost, this is what you created, our strategy and vision, and this is how my recommendation better fits into it than what you're coming up with. I think that's a really good way of framing it. We had a question come up on chat about the HR and internal comms blend, and I think this probably is one that we can cover off in a couple of ways. There's the question about who controls the messaging and content if we're seeing ourselves blend more together. And I think coupled with that, my ask would be, as well as who controls, what do we need from each other in HR and internal comms? How do we work together nicely?
Good question. I guess that's for me. Yeah, so I think, first of all, one thing that we've seen through State of the Sector, sort of the data that's come through in the past few years, is that comms now seems to have the ear of leadership. There's a recognition that the comms function is important. When it comes to kind of how they can support each other, I think if everyone is very clear on their role and their responsibility and their purpose, and so, you know, back to that kind of one of those original slides, if you've decided that as a comms function, your purpose is to help foster culture and belonging, I'm sure the people team are going to have some goals or, you know, KPIs around that. So how can you work together to sort of set joint objectives so that you're both kind of reaching that end? So I think it's about being very clear on what everybody's sort of internal functional purpose is, but then how does that connect up to the business as well? So, you know, no company ever wanted a communications function. Let's put it that way. Companies only ever wanted people on the front lines, people out there in the workforce, to know what's going on so that they could do their jobs, to feel like they fit into a bigger picture so that they have a pleasant experience, right? So, you know, thinking beyond, you know, the measurement reach and like the kind of glamour metrics we talk about, like reach and understanding, through to let's look at what behaviors are needed. And so HR and the people function will have some clear guidance around what people should be doing in their roles for performance management, and communicators should be reinforcing those messages. So that's where that kind of world-class, you know, the 9 hallmarks tool that we have, if you've got a clear narrative on what the business is aiming for, that is your gospel. That's what you should be working on as the communicator to help support the people function and help support the business. Bit of a roundabout, long-winded way. There's no easy answer, but that's my 2 cents anyway.
So important, that business partnering contract to each other and what we can expect of each other. I think really, really important. I'm getting a flurry of questions through, so we better press on. But I'm going to tie this one from Joey that we're going to answer live. Do you think notice board in office is still important? How can we make better use on the board to encourage interaction and communication, with another channel being the other side of it? Okay, so I mean, notice board is one channel that you can go for. I'm sure Sean and Drew can share their thoughts on that, but also on digital platforms. How do we get employees connected there as well? We think on the 2 different threads.
I think from the notice board side of things, we still see a massive role for that within the organizations we work with. So obviously when we're talking about deskless workers, it might be retail, healthcare, it might be manufacturing setting. It's unlikely that those people are going to have a laptop in their pocket. They might have a phone in their pocket. Can they use it on the floor? They may not be able to. So, you know, it is still important. I think talking about consumer grade experience, we kind of need to honor and value people's eyes and their attention. So can you make it as, you know, creative or standout as possible without kind of, I've seen some notice boards where there's like 100 things competing for attention. So I understand. Can you make them bigger? You know, from my point of view as an agency, putting together a great poster campaign and then seeing it printed out like this size and put like on a hallway, a blank hallway. So can you honor the space and put it on a better board? But also I've seen work well QR codes. So if people are in a situation where they can use their phone, having a simple QR code on the poster saying, what did you think of this message? And people can feed back. Or even like getting really lo-fi if phones aren't allowed. Even stuff like sticker voting, and bear with me, have you ever seen those things where you have 2 columns and you can go and pick a sticker and like you dot vote on which side you prefer? So, or even you may have seen like a similar thing as like cigarette butts, and it's like, you know, the Beatles or Elvis and all football teams, I don't know any, but you put your cigarette butt and you kind of vote like that. So there's definitely still a role for the notice board, and I think it can only sort of support and enhance what's going on online as well. So the other part of your question was about how do we connect the 2, or?
You know, that's a great response around, I think, you know, a very traditional channel around notice boards, and almost updating it with QR codes because everyone's become more used to them post-COVID. But if we want to connect people more on the likes of a Yammer or intranet, do you bring human interaction there?
Good question. I think, again, back to the 9 hallmarks, classic Sean. The channel framework and being clear what each channel is used for. So I know Yammer has, you know, Yammer's good. It can work well. It depends how you roll it out. But I know a lot of people pick up Yammer because it comes with part of the Microsoft suite. So a lot of times if it's just released into the business, people might not be clear on how to use it, what it's for, how does it fit into all of the other channels that they're kind of experiencing every day. So I think it's about clarity from the top down of what the channels are for. And then once people understand what it's for, oh, it's for sharing pictures of your pets, or it's for the CEO to do his weekly video on, you know, what's happening in the business, then, you know, people become comfortable with the kind of the cadence and the purpose and what they can expect to see there. And then we can start to see interaction building. Also, how much time do people have to be on non-essential channels, building that in. If people maybe have 15 minutes a week or an hour a week that you are kind of allowing or assuming they have to spend, how can you load up different channels with different content in that way?
And I think just to add to that point, Sian, a big part of working out what your channels are used for isn't just you sitting down at a big table with a big sheet of paper and saying, we will use Teams for this, we will use Yammer for this. These are tools you're giving to your employees, and the majority of them now have some form of two-way or at least grassroots communication. So it's about listening. It's about going, what emergent uses are there for these tools? And one of the biggest things that we see when a company spends millions rolling out a new channel and they've worked out exactly what it's for and they've got their content calendar set up and it's brilliant, they roll it out and then no one engages with it. And usually the first question that they ask is, why is no one engaging with it? They need to see these communications, they need to use it. And if you go out and talk to their employees, the majority of them go, oh, we're all already using this other channel for that. Because they have found the right channel in the mix along the way, and they found a solution that works for them that doesn't include this new channel, and you don't even know necessarily that communication's going on over there in this little bubble. So as communicators, you've not accounted for it in your matrix, you've not accounted for it in the way those channels are used. So it's not just about sitting down in a vacuum and deciding exactly what all the channels are going to be used for. It's about constantly checking in. Actually, is there a Teams channel that's just full of loads of people's pets? Awesome, great. Okay, we won't install Yammer for people's pets, and thinking about it that way rather than as just a top-down approach.
Needs-based rather than channel-based, which starts with listening.
We're rooting this back around, aren't we, as a continuous cycle of listening that's always needed. And I think this really speaks to me. I was judging last week some of the IOIC awards, and I was a little bit surprised how little research we do with our own audience to figure out the right configuration of our channels, the right content and things that they'll want to hear from you. If you really want employee buy-in, include them from the start and the inception of the idea, rather than just push something to them and expect them to adopt it. That's the way of doing it. So it's very much like building anything. Next question that we've got is from an anonymous attendee. Survey fatigue is being shared as a reason by C-suite to not approve staff surveys to collect information or data about anything. Is survey fatigue a real thing? Is this the result of not sharing results or actionable items? Yes. How do we avoid this pitfall? I might give this a punt myself first, if that's okay, just coming from the listening space at this point, and then you can obviously please do add, Chandra, if you do think so. But I absolutely believe survey fatigue is a thing, but it's to do with not acting. If you are listening, and as Sian earlier said, and I think Drew, both of you mentioned, if you're asking questions and you can't act on them, there is no point asking a question at that point in time. You should only be asking for information or feedback where something is actionable or possible for you to review and think about or even consider. A lot of the time, I think we get into a place of fear when we receive results that we can't solve things for our employees. But I think what's really important as leaders is that we have to shift away from feeling that we need to know all the answers, that we are seen to be this God that has everything and all the knowledge within us. It's okay to say we don't know, or no, we can't do that, but we have to tell them that. We have to close the circle and make sure that we communicate that back. That for me quite often reduces any survey fatigue and when it comes to employee listening. But I would also say, in terms of the first point, a lot of people pull out survey fatigue and the C-suite tell you that you've got survey fatigue, but they can't list all the surveys that have gone on. They've got no clue how many there are. They just know that they've heard 2 recently that they've had discussions about. So the starting point is to map all the surveys, all the listening that you're doing at that point in time, and the needs again as to where it's missing, because it's all very well running something like a health and safety survey, but are you understanding the true depths of employee experience and things like that? Sian, Drew, anything to add?
I would say that survey fatigue is a symptom. It's not a disease in and of itself. It's a symptom of bad management of your surveys. And very similar anecdote. We were doing some work with a client who said that they wanted to send out an email, but couldn't send it out because they had way too many other emails, and all of their employees were constantly saying, no, we don't want any more emails. And the problem wasn't that they didn't want this one new email. The problem was they didn't want the 20 something other emails that were getting sent that made no difference to their job, that didn't engage with them, that didn't do anything. And actually that one other email might have been the one that engaged them with reading emails about their work. And it's the same with surveys. Even if they have data to back up that surveys are tired and no one wants a survey, which you'd only gather by asking them in a survey, that data only proves that as a concept they have fatigue, not as a specific, well-formed, well-output, well-designed survey that might go down 100%. And the other element there is, as Mel, you said, comes back into that negative point. We have to, as communicators, be okay with saying bad things. And we might get a survey where everybody says, hey, we want a pay rise. Hey, we want this. Hey, we want that. We have to be okay, if we're asking that question, to go back and say, you can't have that. And again, that should all tie back into the business goals, the reasons you exist, the operating principles you work within. But the thing is, as soon as you get that negative feedback, the business usually just shuts up. No one talks about anything to anybody. And it falls back into that category of, oh, another survey where they asked us our opinion and nothing happened. So it's not a problem with surveys. The problem is how you're dealing with the outputs of those surveys, and to a certain extent, your channel matrix. Are you aware of all those surveys that are being sent? And how do you keep a handle on them to make sure you're not asking the same question in 5 different surveys throughout a year? So it is about balance, but 100% survey fatigue usually isn't that there are too many surveys. It's usually that people are tired of nothing happening, even though they keep putting in the effort to tell people their opinions.
I would add to that too, from my, as an employee, everything that Drew said. But the other thing too is the effort that's been put into the survey, because I often feel like sometimes as communicators, well, oh, let's just quickly ask this, or, oh, you know, we'll throw in a question about that. And again, you know, don't ask what you can't action. But how well written or poorly written is my experience of the survey good? Because if I get a question that actually, well, that doesn't apply to me, or I don't know how to answer it, or that's worded funny and I don't know if I agree or disagree, that just adds that kind of like weight on my shoulders to kind of figure it out. And then the feedback or the data that you get back from that's not accurate anyway, because people have kind of had to fudge their way through, or, you know, questions that are mandatory that I don't have an answer for, things like that. So again, quality of survey over quantity, but sort of from both sides, only actioning it, but also giving people a good experience of the actual survey.
Significantly there. I'm going to go to, there's a question in the chat box from Rachel Evans. What are best practices to encouraging senior leaders to engage with the communication tools? We often see our top level leaders not adopting our comms tools, and therefore their staff disengages as well. Anybody want to start with that? Good
question. I think, again, I'm going to go back to the 9 hallmarks.
You created that for a reason.
Knowing what the channels are for and why they exist. So again, from, you know, what Drew was saying, rather than saying, here's all the channels and here's how we're going to use them. Actually, here are all our comms needs and here's how our channels are going to solve them for you. So I think, you know, understanding what senior leaders need. Maybe they don't need a tool, maybe they need time. Maybe they need clarity on their role and what they're expected to do. Maybe they need some resources. So you know, that there's always these huge statistics around how much of employee experience depends on line managers, and that kind of starts at the top. So setting expectations, setting that you know, KPIs, how we're going to show up, that authenticity. So I think if people understand why things exist and how they can help them, and that will kind of go a long way in getting them to engage. So it might be a bit of an internal rah-rah campaign to say, hey, we've got something that can help you, rather than please use this thing. It's this tool is going to help you solve that thing that was really bugging you. So looking at it maybe from the leader point of view rather than the tool point of view and engagement point of view.
I think, funnily enough, when we run surveys and there's a leader that's weaker on communications, they do really stand out on a heat map. And believe it or not, that leader quite quickly then improves their engagement with comms tools. I think that's really important in terms of that benchmarking against their peer group, demonstrating who's excellent of that. I think always having somebody who's like an MD or a C-suite that is fantastic at it, and you can demonstrate that has bred better engagement or better ideas or results for their team. I think that's a good way of showing them the carrot when you don't have a stick. Okay.
And I think there's a balance to that as well. Going through COVID, the number of senior leaders who suddenly became very visible on all sorts of comms platforms, and how unmanageable that became, because it was all totally up in the air how long this was all going to be, and they spent hours talking to all of their staff all of the time on Slack, and then suddenly when they realized this is going to go on for months, if not years, it just all either immediately stopped or they tried to carry it on, and it just became overwhelming. And employees kind of saw behind the curtain and saw that their leader isn't just this person who gets wheeled out and makes an inspirational speech every now and again. They're a normal, living, breathing human being, and that's great. But then when they see their normal, living, breathing human being absolutely flooded with messages, it's about finding that balance in there. And the same as we talked about line managers in general earlier. If communication is part of your role, and as a senior leader, you are leading, you have to communicate. You're not just very good at what you do, you're very good at helping other people do that too. Then there should be training, there should be an expectation that you need to be upskilled and you need to be better at that. And it's about building that time and space into that expectation as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that look of leader has changed completely. We're looking for more inclusive, engaging leaders than ever before. And the next generations that are coming up in the world that are entering the workforce will not stand for your autocratic tell and listen to me stance. Right, I have one more question at the moment from Lauren. What's been your biggest challenge in relation to EE and how did you overcome it? Looking for real examples here. Oh, juicy.
I can go first, Sean, while you think of yours if you want. So this is a really difficult one, because obviously biggest challenge is very relative. Like we might have biggest in terms of the kind of clients that we work with who just have no channels whatsoever or no centralized data. But probably the one that's most valuable in terms of understanding it is a manufacturing company we work with, from my perspective. And they were going through a massive restructure. Their industry had been changed pretty much forever by world events, and they were having to rationalize quite a lot of their business. Obviously, as employees, their engagement was through the floor. Every single message that came out, they expected to be the message telling them they didn't have a job. Every single time their company spent any money on anything, they got hounded for not spending that on keeping employees. So it was a terrible situation for them to be in as an employer. And the journey that we had to go on for them was not only reorganizing their comm structure, but doing it in a way that was sensitive to all of that negativity. Because as a company, they were doing incredible things, and the entire board of the company were so engaged with trying to make sure if they lost a single employee, that before they went, they had taken them on job-related learning, they'd found new careers for them. Wherever they were closing a factory, they were trying as hard as they could to sell it off to a competitor, anything to keep those people in work and keep those families fed. And a big part of that journey was authenticity. And authenticity only comes from being able to empathize with your audience. And so every single bit of comms that we did, every conversation that we had, obviously sensitively, without looking like they were spending an incredible amount of money, we were testing to make sure, actually, does this account for the real world that you exist in? Does this account for the people that you're talking to? Are we going to try it with someone and then they're going to say, oh yeah, but XYZ? Trying to get rid of as many of those XYZs before we went into the actual conversation, and making it feel as authentic as possible, which meant making sure the company message was very honest throughout, making sure if a leader was saying something, the leader was saying it. It wasn't a PR message that they were reading from a script. It was something that came from their heart. So it might not even be your direct line manager talking to you. It might be a line manager from across the business, because they're the person who is most likely to be effective in getting that message across, because it's personally related to them. And finding those individual touch points that made it valuable, and rationalizing where we could to make it seem valuable. So not spending loads on making all those channels look good and making sure there's comms fresh out on the intranet to keep it up to date and vibrant, but the right comms were there at the right time, and they had that sense of realism about them, which only comes from making sure that the speaker is listening to the person who's meant to be receiving the message.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Lauren, in answer to your question, at WorkBuzz, we see a lot of challenges in relations to EE, but it's no one size fits all for organisations. And how you overcome it very much depends on what the challenge is, from needing to have a leadership culture that becomes shifted and a more mature leadership team that gets coached through that, improving retention. And normally with retention, it's onboarding or that we're doing wrong. So within the first 60 days, making sure we're nailing that process and listening to people as they join the organisation, so that they're involved in the culture, that the job meets the expectations, exiting, gathering data, and making sure that we can plug it back into everything that we're doing with processes, to well-being. So there's such a myriad of things that come out. But I think what I just wanted to do was make sure that I had a couple of minutes for somebody to answer this question, because it is from an anonymous attendee, so we wouldn't be able to follow up. But they're on quite a complicated project with 7 companies collaborating, and they're having trouble engaging with colleagues. So some are office-based, some are on site and not connected. They all work for different organisations, so there's no brand alignment. How do you connect them? Sean, Drew, who wants to go for that one? That's a big one.
That's an entire project.
Yeah.
Come speak to us. No, so I think the first thing, and this is for us, sort of as strategists, is always connecting to the why. So why do you need them to be connected? What's the bottom line on that? What's the business reason? What's in it for me for connecting? And I think if you can nail down, there might be, from the business lens, we need to increase productivity or innovation, and that happens when we collaborate and this, all that kind of good stuff. But from the employee point of view, listening to employees and finding out not just sort of like where they sit in the organization, but what they're trying to achieve personally. Are they interested in just coming to work and going home? Do they want to be part of something bigger? What sort of attracted them to the organization? And maybe there's some, unifying traits in their mindset and their behaviors that you can start to speak to, these groups of people in their language, to encourage them to connect, because there's something in it for them, and their sort of personality type, their point in life. It's not easy. I mean, it's not easy. We're not going to answer it in 3 minutes, because this is the stuff that we work for months and years on. But the main thing is sort of the listening, the getting to the understanding of why do you need to connect people. And once you have that, it becomes a lot easier to start to map out some of the solutions. Drew, I don't know if you can solve it in 2.
I'll try in 2. So it is a really difficult one, obviously. I think that central voice, what we used to call back in the days of everybody being in one office, one war room, where everybody could look each other in the whites of their eyes and go, yeah, you're part of this, I'm part of this, let's work on this together, is really difficult to replicate in a hybrid environment of whatever form. But personalizing it is a huge step there, making sure that built into that project there are opportunities for people who usually wouldn't meet to meet, whether that's in reality, virtually, just anything like that. Build time in, because that communication structure, which usually would have been able to happen naturally if they were all aligned and in one location, if you build that in up front and at touch points throughout the project, it's far more valuable than not doing it and everybody having to try and work around it. And it's down to little things like, and there's a great author called Gretchen McCulloch, and she focuses on how language develops and how subcultures can be created. And a huge part of communication is tiny little inside jokes, idioms, anything like that. And a project team working across any size can come together under a barrier of their own personal language that is just formed over time. And the quicker you can get that formed, the better your communications are going to land. And that's not something that you can force top down. You can only do that by allowing them time to develop it as a voice internally and giving them the tools to do that. And whether that's giving them a load of tools, seeing what lands and helping curate them, as opposed to saying, this is the one tool you have to use, fit to it, it can be the best way forward.
Great. Thank you both. Very helpful. Right. I think we are at our time. So unfortunately, there's no more time for Q&A. But if you have any more questions, please just email them across and we will be absolutely happy to answer them. Just email hello@workbuzz.com and we'll get them shared with Sian and Drew. So thank you for listening. You can look out for an email from our colleagues, Emily or Fiona at WorkBuzz in the next few days. That will include the webinar recording, the slides and any other additional resources like this the QR code to benchmark your internal communications. Please do come and join us at our next webinar where we're talking about how to boost retention through employee engagement and focusing very much on one of our amazing clients, Hearts Group. They are in hospitality and have restaurants all over London, some amazing brands within them. So I would highly recommend that you do come and join us for that webinar. But of course, if you have any questions or you want to learn more, then just please email hello@workbuzz.com and we will get back to you. Thank you very much for your time.